I would like to take a look at a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, sages of the chapters of the fathers, and there's a beautiful Mishnah that sometimes there's some Mishnayos that are much more famous than others. Just like certain lines in the Torah that everybody recognizes, and others doesn't sound like anything I've ever heard before. For some reason, certain Mishnayos also ring in our ears as though that's already famous. Hillel said, "Hu hayomer imenani limili." If I'm not going to be for me, then who will be for me? Right? There's a famous one. Everybody knows that one. Even Gentiles know that one. Certain lines in the Torah everybody knows. Lo alechem levado yichya adam ela motzi b'pi Hashem yichya adam. It's not by it's not by bread alone does a man live, except that which comes out of the mouth of Hashem. That's what a person lives on. Whatever these phrases mean. Here's one that seems to slip under the radar, and it makes a little bit of sense because it's really talking about things that slip under the radar, that we don't notice, that don't really have importance to us. But it might be worthwhile not to dismiss these things that they're talking about. And the Mishnah says the following thing: Hu haya omer. It's going back when it says he used to say. It's hearkening back to the previous speaker, and again in the context of what the previous speaker said, we can understand what he's saying here also. Ben Azai is the previous one who's speaking in the Mishnah beforehand, and he says in the previous Mishnah, it's not the one we're going to learn, Havirat le mitzvah kala. He says run after a small mitzvah. Run after a small mitzvah. He says, what's considered a small mitzvah? Maybe some people say, I don't do that. I only do big stuff. I think someone told me that John Kennedy had said in one of his speeches or something like that, like, big people do big things, right? And small people do small things. And I remember one of my very pointing out and saying just the opposite. There's no job too small for the big man, right? That's why the Kohen Gadol used to go, the young Kohanim used to go running up the ramp, right, in order to see who's going to take out the Trumas Hadeshin, who's going to take out the garbage in the base of Mikdash, right? The Chovos Levavos says, don't look at the size of the sin. When he's talking about in the chapter having to do with tshuva, he says, rather look at the one in front of whom the sin was done. It's the same thing when it comes to do a mitzvah. You're going to look at, it's a big thing, it's a small thing, you get a big covet for it, a big honor, a small honor. Forget about it. The Kohanim would run up the ramp, they would compete. Who's going to take out the garbage? Right? I used to work in an organization, and I like the teamwork of the people that I'm working with now because probably I'm going to say something. It doesn't matter who does the job. Everybody has to be willing to stand up at the lectern. Everybody has to be ready to stick their hand to take a plunger into their hand if that's what they have to do. Everybody's got to be willing to do every job. I remember my wife always reminds me, tell that story again. I don't know why she asked me to tell that story, but there's a story. I can't get the hint yet. There's a story about a fella. He was learning in Eretz Israel. Every year, his beard grew longer, whiter. His coat grew longer. His hat got bigger. Until he was becoming a huge Talmud Chacham. One day he comes home and his wife tells him, Herschel, take out the garbage. Which reminds me of another story I'm going to say. Okay, there's a lady this fellow goes to the rabbi and says, Rabbi, my wife is harassing me. She's haranguing me. She's nudging me. There's another good word over here. I know there's a better word. Right? She's making me. Rabbi says, so what do you mean she's harassing you? Tell me. Give me an example. He says, I'm sitting on Erev Pesach. He says, and I'm carving the horseradish, to prepare for the Seder. I'm minding my own business, carving the horse. And she comes over, she goes, Herschel, take down the sukkah. Take down the sukkah. Okay, got to harken back. It's Pesach, and he's carving. Take down the sukkah. Okay, so what happened? My wife told me that this fellow, his wife says, take out the garbage. Guy says, it's not lefi kvodi. It's not my honor to take out. I can't take out the garbage. Who am I to take out the garbage? I can't take out the garbage. I'm not allowed to take out the garbage. She goes, are you sure? He says, I'll go ask the Rosh Kollel. I'll go ask the Rosh Yeshiva if that's the thing, whether I'm allowed, cover the Torah, whether I'm supposed to be the one to take out the garbage. So he goes to the Rosh Kollel. He says, my wife has me take out the garbage. I said, it's not lefi kodi, to be taking out the garbage. What do you think? And the Rosh Yeshiva says, you're exactly right. It's not your covet. It's not fitting for your covet to take out the garbage. You should not take out the garbage. So he goes home. He tells his wife, I spoke to Rosh Hashiva, and he agrees. It's not fitting my honor that I should take out the garbage. His wife was a little bit surprised. Really? That's what he said? A few minutes later, a knock comes at the door. Who's there? The Rosh Kollel. He says, can you show me, Mrs. Berkowitz, can you show me where the garbage is, please? He said, I'm going to take out the garbage. He goes, whoa. He says, it's not for you. You're not big enough to take out the garbage. You have to have a certain madrega, a certain high level in order to be merit-worthy to take out the garbage. I don't know why my wife tells me to tell that story. Like I still can't figure it out why she had that in mind. So the Mishnah says, Havi Ratzla mitzvah kala, run to a light mitzvah. Run even to a light mitzvah, which seems to you to be, it's a nothing. Right? And the Mishnah explains why. And it says the following thing. He says, Uberech min avera, and to run away even from a small avera. Well, what's the big deal? It's a small thing. It's a kleiner thing. A little bit. You still take a penny. It's $1 million. I made a phone call on someone. Whatever. I didn't do something big. I took something, small item. Shemitzvah goreres mitzvah. Because mitzvahs bring along a chain of mitzvahs. There's a momentum. There's an inertia in mitzvahs. The avera goreres avera. And an avera can bring about the whole chain of averas. It sets a tempo going in a certain direction. And it says, Shachar mitzvah mitzvah. The reward of the mitzvah is the mitzvah itself. It's not something that's external that comes. And Shachar avera, and the reward of an avera, of a violation, is the violation itself. Right? I remember I said to my son, I had my oldest son at his bris a number of years ago, 27 years ago. Okay, I'm trying to remember, but I always remember what I say. I don't know why, I go to that's the importance this is not the style of, this is not real legitimate style of teaching. Teaching means that you're engaging students, that they should be able to have input also, because people remember what they say. They don't remember what the Rebbe says. Right? Only if it resonates with them, then they find themselves saying and agreeing somehow in their minds with what the Rebbe is saying. Remember, one of our Rebbeim once asked, he says, he threw out a little riddle for us just to get our minds jump started for the class. He says, what do you learn from a clock that's stuck, that's right twice a day? What do you learn from such a clock? We all sat there scratching our heads, and my hand crept up, and I gave an answer. I don't just remember what I said, but I remember at Shalashudas that week, he says, Rabbi Label, he gave a great answer. He liked my answer. So I remember sitting over there thinking, I remember my answer. I don't remember anybody else's answer. My answer was, if you see a guy that's eating on Erev Yom Kippur, right, which is a mitzvah to eat at that time, and he's drinking on Purim, that doesn't mean you can learn from him the rest of the year, right? Right? Sometimes you have a person, he's eating and drinking all the time, Just so happens, you happen to catch him, but he's doing the right thing at the right time, but not necessarily for the right reason. Okay, we just happen to be coordinated. So here was my son's bris 27 years ago, and I was thinking to myself, why Avraham Avinu is the pillar of Chesed. He's the one that's afflicting his eight. You have this brand new little baby. Next thing you know, you're bringing him in for surgery, voluntary surgery, right? But it's a voluntary surgery that the Jewish people have been afflicting on. And one of the symptoms of a Jew, one of the signs of a Jew, is that we're Rachmanim, we're merciful people. And here we come along and we take this child and we bring him into a situation where we have to put bandages on him. It's very, very uncomfortable. And one of the answers, I was searching for an answer. Sfas Emes says that because Avraham Avinu was tested to go against his character trait, for Avraham Avinu to serve a deli sandwich, good evening, for Avraham Avinu to serve, to heat-stricken strangers a tongue sandwich, no problem, right? But to do something that went against his native character, that was the. But I was thinking there has to be a chesed shebagvura, a kindliness even in the strictness, even in the din, in the affliction that he's putting onto this child. And I came up with two answers at that time, and I have a few more percolating in my mind. But I remember at that time, the yeshiva was learning a tractate called Bava Metzia. Bava Metzia is talking about what belongs to whom. And when does the owner lose ownership of something? I'm walking in the street and $1 fell out of my pocket. Now, can anybody just pick it up and take possession of it? Maybe if I'm in the shul, somebody can announce, I found some money, tell me the quantity of money that you found. But if it's in the middle of Times Square and you find $1, can you keep the $1? So the Gemara discusses all these details. It says that you find 3 quarters that are piled up next to each other, that means the owner has not given up. That's what it means, right? If you find something that's bundled up and it has some kind of a sign that's attached to it, that the owner says, I'm looking for something that had a red thread that it was around it, or it was stacked up 5. The things don't fall out of a person's pocket and stack up 5. He put it there an Erev Shabbos because he realized he had money in his pocket and he's going to come back for it, which wasn't scattered, out of the back of the truck. So Kodesh Baruch Hu came and he said, put a stamp on this child, on every Jewish child. Because a person can't take possession of it until the owner is given up. Because now I know I have a sign on each Jewish child, and it means that even if the person goes out into the world and they gave up on themselves, that the owner of Kodesh Baruch Hu has not given up on this child. Right? That's a stamp. That's what it means. We have a seal that's written on that child. And the other idea intersects with this Mishnah that we just happen to be peeking at right now, and that is that the Gemara tells us that David HaMelech, right, was at one time he hit a little point of despondency. Gemara says, what was the situation? Gemara in Shabbos says, what was the situation? He happened to be at the mikveh, and he realized he was devoid of, there was no mezuzah on the door, there's no tzitzis, there's no tefillin, he's without mitzvahs. One of my wife's teachers in Eretz Israel told her many years ago that when a bird stops flapping its wings, it does not remain in the same place. So you understand that that person's either going up or going down, like by Yaakov Avinu's ladder. V'hinei sulam mutzav artzav v'rosha magia shemaima v'malach Elohim olim v'yordim bo. There was nobody parked over there. There was no traffic jams. They're either going up or they're going down. Right? There's no in-betweeners. And David HaMelech must have realized at that time, I must be going down. Right? I can't be standing in the same place. So the Gemara says that that at that moment over there he was feeling despondent, and then he was consoled by the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had given him a mitzvah, a kviyas dika mitzvah, a fixed mitzvah on his flesh, that he now had a bris milah, and the bris milah reminded him and somehow brought him back to life and brought him back to simcha again. I was thinking, why is that? Because of this principle that's mentioned over here, sachar mitzvah, the reward of a mitzvah is a mitzvah, and the reward of an avera is an avera. This one, and also that the mitzvah goreris mitzvah, and avera goreris avera, that he's either going in this direction or going in that direction. Now the problem is, when starting anything, is you need the first in order to get to the second, right? If let's say a person, their license was revoked, they go to the judge, revocation of license. Now I got to go to the DMV to get a new license. How do we get to the DMV without a license? How do I get, right? How do you get a license without a license? Then you go to get a job, and they say, so what was your previous job? Well, I've been out of, so, you're out of the workforce, so you can't get a job unless you had another job, unless you have work experience. So you need you need a job to get a job. You need an apartment. Which apartment are you coming from to get an apartment? Right? You need credit to get credit. It's dark, suddenly the lights go out, Sandy, suddenly we're all looking around, and I have to find where do I put those matches, where to put the candles. You need a candle to find a candle. You need a light to find a light. You need money to make money. This is the problem all over the world. And the same thing, you need mitzvahs to make mitzvahs. Rabbi Label Lam says, I'm stuck over here. If mitzvah goreris mitzvah, then where do I get the first mitzvah to get me started into the career of mitzvahs? And the answer is, I put over there for you a mitzvah that's fixed there, and whenever you want to start, it's a down payment on whenever you want to start in a career of mitzvahs. That's the chesed that Avraham Avinu had given to all of his children. That's what I was thinking at the time also. I remember having heard a story from a chavrus of mine. We were studying Yeridea together 28 years ago now. And he came back from must have been the Torah Masorah convention, and he told me, those numbers sound big, don't they? I see people say, wow, 20, yeah. I'm only 21, I'm only 19, Yes, I could be your grandfather 3 times over, although I still feel 17, pardon me. So he said that there was a young fellow, he was learning, he came to yeshiva, he was in the Hebrew day school, and the problem, and he came in, and there was a new Rebbe, new fiery Rebbe, just came out of yeshiva, filled with idealism, and he starts teaching the students in this local out-of-town Hebrew day school. He starts teaching them halachot. He's teaching them in the laws about how a Jew is supposed to conduct himself. And early on, in the early pages of Orach Chaim, it starts to talk about how a person gets dressed in the morning. You put on your right shoe first, right? And then you put on your left shoe. And then you tie your left shoe, if you happen to be a righty, because that's tefillin, then you tie your right shoe. But first you put on your right shoe, because that's the first step when you step, just like when you step forward to do Shemona Esrei, you step over the right foot, because that's the first step towards mitzvahs. And, he gives him a whole what for. Of course, like any other good boy, this young fellow goes home, and his mother asks him, what did you learn today? And he says, when you get dressed, you put on your right shoe first, because that's the first shoe to go to foot to go towards mitzvahs. And then you put on your left shoe and you tie your left shoe. His mother happened to be on the board of directors of the school. Right? I remember heard from Rabbi Gifter Zatzal. He once said that a principal with the board, a board means with a beard, is git. He says, but the board with the principal is nishgit. So the mother was the head of the board. And she says, what kind of medieval stuff is he teaching over there, filling your heads with all this poisonous, superstitious, nonsense? And so she called a meeting, and she says, where did we get this guy from? And look what he's doing to our kids. He's poisoning our children's minds. They had him dismissed. And the fellow moved on to some other place. He got a job some other place, and he moved on. Meanwhile, this young fellow went through 8th grade in the local Hebrew day school, and he went out to public high school. By the way, when kids leave the Hebrew day school at the age of 8, they end up with an inoculation against Judaism, and very often they have a harder time coming to Judaism later on if they don't follow through and go all the way. They get enough of enough of the disease in order to build up the antibodies to think that they got it, but they never really got it. And they're much harder to teach. So here's this young fella. He went through the 8th grade. He went out to public school. Then he got accepted into a high-minded university, I think like Princeton. And there he wanted to be a doctor. Back then everybody was a pre-med, wanted to be a doctor. Before HMOs, he wants to be a doctor. Before whatever care is coming down or doesn't care coming down the road over here. And he wanted to be a doctor. And of course he was struggling with bio and chemistry. So he needed a tutor in chemistry, a chavrusa partner. And he found a partner in chemistry. And it turned out that there was chemistry between he and his chemistry partner. And it turned that she was Kathy, a nice Gentile girl. And they fell in love. Right? And this fella came home and says, Mom, this is, Kathy, we're in love, And mother says, what? She's not Jewish. Ma, I love her. Okay, I just want you to be happy. As long as you're happy, you'll raise them Jewish. Yes, we'll raise them Jewish. So they made a giant wedding. They arranged in a hotel a giant wedding. And there the fellow was there that night where he's supposed to get married to this nice Catholic girl. And as he was preparing for the wedding, he's in his hotel room. And he takes out his black tie affair. He takes out that monkey suit they wear? What's that penguin outfit? The tuxedo. Takes out his tuxedo, and he puts it on with the cummerbund. And now he takes out of the box a brand new shiny pair of shoes. And he's about to step into his shoes, and he says, "Oh, such an important occasion! I think I remember once having heard. I can't remember where I heard it. That when you're getting dressed and you're putting on your shoe for an important occasion, you put on your right shoe first, because that's the first foot that goes towards mitzvahs." And suddenly the word mitzvahs wakes up in his mind, and he realizes that he's about to take a step that will separate him from the history and the destiny of the Jewish people. And he calls off, with Samson's strength, he calls off the entire wedding. He gives a call that night to his previous Rebbe from so many years ago. And he tells him the following thing. He calls him up and he says, "Hi, he says, "Yes." He said, "My mother was on the board. She got you fired." So he says, "I forgave you. Don't worry about it." He said, "Moved to another school." He says, "Nera met my beshert, and we're doing fine over here and everything." He says, it was providential. It worked out good for me. He said, No. He didn't. I didn't call up to apologize, which I should. He says, "I just want to let you know that." He told him the story. He says, "You saved my life." Right? Just that little point over there. It says, so the Mishnah that we were just looking at, which is just an introduction to the Mishnah, is the statement by Ben Azai that says, "Habirat mitzvah kala." Don't take any mitzvah too lightly, right? And why is that? Because mitzvah gereres mitzvah. Once a person, you pull a thread, out of a garment, and you keep on pulling, suddenly the whole sleeve can fall off. From that little pull, from that little piece of thread, it's access. The person can access everything. Bein latov, bein lara. Right? A person can begin to sow and can build up anything from the smallest amount. Like somebody who buys a lottery ticket. I have a friend of mine, he has a brother in Baltimore that got $1 from the Lubavitch Rebbe and ended up winning $1 million lottery. Right? How about that? He was down to his bone, and he went and he bought. It's a true story. True story. He got $1 from that dollar. He ended up losing all that money and getting into. Okay, never mind. But that was his bechira. Anyway. Now the next Mishnah that I want to dive into, and says the following thing. This is really the main point of the evening. Hu Hayomer used to say, this is the same Ben Azai, Al tihi vaz l'chol adam. Don't take anybody, don't be disparaging, and don't be dismissive of any person. Right? Listen to this. He says, Va'al tihi maflig m'chol davar. He said, l'chol davar. And don't separate yourself from anything. Right? And why is that? She'ein l'cha adam she'ein lo shah. Because there's no person that doesn't have his moment. Ve'ein l'cha davar. And there's no thing. She'ein lo makom. If something is in this world, it comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and therefore it has, and everybody has, their reason for being. We may not know at this moment why this person is here, or why this thing is here, right? There's a certain emunah that everything is taking up a place. Nothing is here, and nobody is here by accident, right? It can't possibly be. Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu put it over here. HaKadosh Baruch Hu looks into the Torah, and He creates the world, and here it is. Sometimes before we got a sort of a set sukkah, I used to go down into the basement, and I tell my kids say, "What are you doing on Erev Sukkah?" I said, "There's a sukkah down here someplace." You ever go on one of those adventures where you just everything you're going to pull out is going to be, you're going to find exactly what you need, and whatever it is, I got plenty of nothing, and nothing's plenty for me, and we'll go and we'll put something together over here from whatever we have. It's all here. My kid got embarrassed, and I ended up buying certain set items that ended up rolling out the sukkah. But there's plenty of other places in life where also this applies. And maybe we'll take a look at a few different examples. It's interesting that the word davar over here, like what does it say? He says, Al tehi vaz l'chol adam, don't take anybody light, Al tehi maflig l'chol davar, from any davar. Why is it something called an object, just a regular object, why is it called a davar? Right? So there's one approach is, why is dibor, speech, called dibor, which is related to the word, because it's related to the concept of davar. Because it looks like it's just speech. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never harm me. Nonsense, right? That when somebody says something, it's real stuff. Right? Us, that's what we spoke about on Shabbos. That when we're saying stuff even to ourselves, or somebody says something to us, it can be a life-altering. The Torah is words, right? The world was created with words. So we understand that saying something is closer to a davar. Speech is like an action. It's stuff. It's real stuff when saying and speaking. But also the opposite is true also. Every davar, everything is also speaking. Everything is also talking to us. I feel like telling an amazing story. I happen to know the principle involved with this, in this particular story. But I have a fellow that I worked with for a number of years for Arachim in Eretz Yisrael. His name is Yossi Vallis. Maybe some people heard of him, whatever. Yeah. He runs Arachim in Eretz Yisrael. They're responsible for maybe hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people coming back to Tshuva, and then also the children. A lot of people, change their lives, and then they have tens and tens and tens and tens of thousands of children that came about also. So this is his thing. It's a whole story about how he got into it. I'm almost tempted to tell the story about how he got into it, but maybe I'll stay on this point over here. That Yossi Vallis, I worked with him and I worked for him for a number of years also. So at one time, he told me, and I have a picture at home of him. He had a pet bird, and the bird was not just a regular bird. It was called a tuki, and the bird was speaking all the time, and it was like having a tape recorder in the house. Whatever was said in the house, that's what the bird imitated. It just didn't speak like voice, prowling, It's like if the phone rang, it sounded like the phone was ringing, but it was the bird going, ring, 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 sounding like the phone, And then when they'd say things that they did on a regular basis, like saying Kiddush in front of Yom Hashishi, and then Yossi would answer the phone, Baruch Hashem, Manishma, and he's a Baruch Hashem, Manishma, It would say stuff like Yossi, it would say stuff like the other children, and of course, seeing the person would also signal to the bird somehow to associate, and they would say these things, and the bird was like, it was hysterical. He said you have to be careful around the bird, because one time his wife dropped a pile of dishes, crash, and he said to his wife, klotz. And the bird was echoing for a long time after that. Klotz, 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 quiet over there, So they clipped the wings of the bird. They used to let the bird jump around. I heard this, I heard it directly from him. They used to let the bird, go around the house because it trimmed its wings. One day he says they were out in the backyard. I guess that part of the wings that they clipped have the possibility of growing back. And he said his kid was somehow doing something, was adjusting the dud shemesh, the hot water heater that's attached to the roof, what's it called? The thermal, whatever, from the sun. And suddenly, the hot water came spritzing in the direction of the bird. The bird panicked and flew up into a tree. Now the bird doesn't see well, and suddenly he's disoriented on the top of a tree, and he starts to fly. He flies to the top of another tree. He said, "The bird's flying." They try to catch the bird. He flies to another tree, and the bird disappeared. It flew into the out of sight. And they went looking around. They put up signs. They couldn't find the bird anywhere. There was a report later on. This is really odd, that Yossi's outside of Yossi's mother's porch. She heard Manishma. She went out and said, Yossi's on the porch. She went out there, and there was the bird, and the bird flew away. It was also in Ra'anana. It was found outside. It was heard outside of the hospital in Ra'anana, and then it disappeared. It was never heard from again. A year later, his kids are nudging him for a whole year. But we got to get a bird. But we got to get a bird. But we got to get a bird. He goes, okay. It's expensive. It's $1,000 or something like that to get an investment in the bird. And then you got to start, it doesn't come in talking right away. So they went and they got themselves an infant bird and they brought it into the house. It cost them a pretty penny. And of course, he came into work. When you come to work, you talk about the things that are going on at home. Just built an extension, whatever. We did something in our kitchen, we did whatever. And he comes in, he tells them, I just got a new bird. He's there at the coffee machine, at the misrad, at the office, the organization. And people say, that's right, you had a bird. He says, something, there's a guy who hosts one of the shiurim. Most of the people are channeling into the hundreds and hundreds of seminars that they make through Hugei Bayit, through home sessions, right? That's how you get to meet people, is that people come and who are on the cusp, who are just becoming involved with Judaism, and they still have a circle, an orbit of friends that are still in their orbit, and they invite their friends, and this group has sent hundreds and hundreds of people. He says, so there's a guy there, he says, and he is hosting Chuki Bayit, and they got this bird, and the bird's hysterical. Every time the rabbi says something, he's imitating and he's punctuating all the lectures, and he becomes part of the entertainment. He says, people come to hear the bird, mix into the conversation. It's amazing. So he says, since this guy is involved with Kiruv and helping us out quite a bit, and he has a bird, here's his number. Get in touch with him. You can talk shop with him on 2 different levels. So Yossi gives him a call. And Yossi tells him, yeah. He says, how long you get into the bird scene? And the guy tells him, I'm into the bird scene. He says, about a year. So, And Yossi says, interesting. He says, I lost my bird about a year ago, flew out the back. He tells him a little bit of the story. He says, he gives him some information. My bird was missing on a toe on the left, on the left foot. Suddenly he hears silence on the other side. And then the conversation picks up and continues. He says 2 days later, Yossi was on his way to take his son to Yerushalayim for a first shidduch, and suddenly he gets a phone call in the car, and this fellow says, hi, I think I have your bird. I think he told me he turned around, he canceled the shidduch, and he went back to Ra'anana in order to find out, and he went to the guy's house, and there it was, missing, the exact toe. He did something that you and I shouldn't do. He stuck his finger into the cage. It has a nice raspy tongue, but it can also put a bite onto a person. He says, and the bird licked his finger. He took the bird in the cage home, and suddenly the bird started recognizing and saying things, in front of all the children and everything. And he realized this has to be, it's clear, it's it's clear that this is my bird again. The fellow called him up and he says, I apologize. He says that I didn't let you know right away. He says, when you started describing the bird, he says, I knew immediately it was your bird. He says, but I had to ask a Rav, and I had to discuss it, and I wrestled with myself until I asked the Rav, and he told me, you have a mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda. It's the other man's bird. Give him his bird back. He says, but it was hard for me to leave go with the bird, and he explained why. It turns out, I think it was like 3 weeks. They looked at the count, something like 3 weeks after the bird left Yossi's backyard. It was on a soccer field on Shabbat, right? V'sein soccer tov l'kol haboitchim b'shimcha be'emes. Right there it was on a soccer field, and some guys who were playing soccer came along and said, let's get rid of this thing. Look at this, we've got a dead bird over here. And they were about to kick it off, and says, no. That's an expensive bird, and it's an interesting bird, it's an exotic bird, and I don't think it's dead. They picked it up, and they realized it's not quite dead, but although it was dehydrated. So they said, what do we do? They knew this one fella, happened to be this guy, that was very good with animals, and they brought it to his house, and he started feeding it with an eyedropper. It was this totally secular Israeli fella, and suddenly the bird sits up on a perch and starts saying, Yom HaShishi Vayichulu Hashemayim, and starts to make Kiddush. And the bird says, Baruch Hashem. Yom Hashi, and saying, Hodel Hashem Ki Tov, Kili Elam Chazdo. The bird is saying, like, oh my gosh, the bird is saying, is this the devil? Is this an angel? We don't talk about Hashem. We don't know about Hashem. Suddenly we have a bird in our midst. He's talking about Hashem. Who sent this to us? They got so spooked out. They didn't know what to do with themselves. They got a bird that's speaking in their house like that. They went to they saw that there was a shiur, and they decided it piqued their curiosity. They ended up going to a Torah shiur, and that led them to come to somebody at Chukei Bayit at somebody else's house. Thank you very much. And that led them to go to a seminar. They became religious. Their children became religious, and they hosted. And he says hundreds of other people became through these seminars. He said, thank you very much. And therefore, I had a very strong nostalgic attachment to this bird, but it really belonged to somebody else, right? So you could see, I was thinking that when you hear such a story like that, you can learn 3 very, very powerful and important lessons. So I'm thinking, it's a cute story, right? I once saw in a, excuse me for 1 second, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech shehakolni bidvaro. They say Rabbi Yosef Salanter was at a hotel in France, and it was a very, very fancy place. And he all that was kosher for him to order to meet with this person was he ordered water. Afterwards, the waiter came over and gave him a bill for 10 francs, an enormous sum. He said, Salante says, all I had was a glass of water, senor, or not senor, what? Monsieur. Thank you so much. Okay. He said, all I had was a glass of water. And he says, Rabbina, he says, you're not paying just for the water. You're paying for the ambiance, There's the fan is overhead. There's a fellow tickling the ivories over here. The Pyrenees Mountains is off in the distance, and the art and the painting and the whole, and the milieu, And this is amazing. I didn't know. Was it Mansour? Monsieur. I keep on thinking Rabbi Mansour. Okay. I get locked into that. So Rabbi Yosef said, okay, he paid him and he left a tip. And he went back to his hotel and he wrote a letter to his students in Russia. And he says, now I understand why when we make a blessing on a glass of water, we say, Shahakol nihiyeh bidvaro, that everything came about through a speech. He says, we're not making a bracha only on the water. He says, we're making a bracha on everything. So where were we? So 3 lessons I was thinking that we learn from this story. I once saw in a book, in a cartoon book, where they had a picture. Someone comes into a library. You usually have, fiction and what's the other one? Non-fiction. This one was fiction and stranger than, because truth is stranger than fiction. This is things that happen are much more amazing than anything that anybody could possibly make up sometimes. So I was thinking 3 things. Number one lesson that a person can learn over here is, just in case somebody who's involved with Kiruv, which I've been for the last 30 some odd years, is going to get prideful about themselves and think like, oh, I made that guy and I did this and I did that. Don't think you're such a hot shot. You didn't do anything. A bird could have done your job. You see, Harbei shluchim l'makom. There's a lot of different messengers. The Kodesh Baruch Hu could have sent that one, and could have sent this one. He could have sent the bird. He could have sent to Bilam a talking horse. Don't get so high on your horse. Anybody can make something happen. Number 2. Number 2, the Gemara says that at the end of Masechtas Sukkah, that there was a family that was called Bilga, and they had a daughter. Her name was Miriam. Some say it was Mary in the edited Gemaras, right? Some lady named, okay? Hint, hint, wink, wink, nod, nod, right? A wink is good enough to nod to a blind person. You know what I'm talking about? Okay. So, and apparently she took her, I don't know how she got there, but she took her shoe and she banged it on the shulchan. I don't know how she got close to a shulchan, and she banged it, and maybe it was a table at home. It wasn't the official shulchan, and she cried out and she said, "Wolf, wolf! How long will you consume the money of the Jewish people?" Because there were thousands and thousands of karbonos that were brought by the Kohanim, and her father was a Kohen, and because she spoke so disparagingly about the karbonos that were being brought, so her family's locker was sealed off, and they were not allowed to. They were effectively stopped from doing the avodah, from doing the service in the Beis Hamikdash. So the question the commentator is asking is, what did her family do? What did her father do so wrong? Her daughter spoke badly. And the answer is, if the father would have come home with a different attitude about the korbanos and said, "How was today? Another day, we just spilled another $10 million down the tubes," instead of realizing that the purpose of this animal was served and coming closer to a Kodesh Baruch Hu, Kibbutz Elokim Tov. Instead, he came home with a sour attitude about it, and she detected it, and because she detected it, so that's how it trickled down. And I was thinking that if the language at home would have been different than Yossi's house, right? Then this bird would have gone out and said, "What are you doing? That's not your shell? That's my shell. What are you wearing? I never loaned you my thing. What are you doing? And she would have heard all the arguments and fighting and all the ridiculousness and the sniping that's going on, and it wouldn't have affected anybody latov. But since he was speaking that way at home, right, then the bird flew out and had something effective to do. It had an impact out in the world. The other thing I'm thinking like this, I was thinking, is that the Gemara says, based upon the pasuk that we read every day, twice a day at least, what does b'chol meodecha means? B'chol mida umida shemoded lo. That's what all the measurements that Hashem gives you. Another Rashi says is b'chol mamon, all of your money. So Reb Tzadok Cohen says that what does it mean to love Hashem with all your money? Okay, a number of different explanations. Reb Tzadok Cohen has a beautiful, beautiful chiddush. He says like this. He says that even to the extent that your money, like he says, for example, your objects, like Pinchas ben Yair, he gives an example. The Gemara mentions that there was a very big tzaddik. His name was Pinchas ben Yair, and Pinchas ben Yair was so devoted that even his donkey would not eat tevel. Even his donkey would not eat something that from food which was not tithed properly. Isn't that something? That means that even his animals, kept Shabbos. His animal did the right thing. So if a person is devoted, let's say, to reaching out and to teaching other people to that extent, that even his bird is doing kiruv, even his bird is doing outreach and is able to accomplish it. That's what it means. That even your animals and even your birds are going to accomplish that which is your life mission, that which is your task. Okay, maybe I'd like to share a story. Wow, time flying when we're having fun. I'm having fun. I don't know about anybody else. Okay, I just wanted to mention that. Thank you. I appreciate it, Nechama. That. There was a fellow, when I came to yeshiva 30 some odd years ago, 32, 33 years ago now, my first roommate in yeshiva was a 68-year-old man, right? And his name was, I'll give his name, Mordechai, right? At that time, he didn't go by Mordechai, Milton. 68-year-old fella. I didn't know, I didn't like anybody asking me, like, how did you get here? Because I know that every time I went out to eat in people's houses in Muncie, Dor Samech was a fledgling branch over there, people would always ask me, how did you get here? What does bacon taste like? Did you ever taste this? People, come on, I can't, and you have to come away with like a little resume to tell your story about here, just read this little paragraph over here. I prepared already. Here's my curriculum vitae, how I got it. So I've always felt it was intrusive, and I was always sensitive not to ask people direct questions. Tell us, what happened? So I don't think he's my roommate, 68 years old, young. It wasn't until later on that his son Michael came back to the United States, and we heard that he's engaged, and he came back to the United States and he had his wedding, that I came to understand an amazing thing. It was at the Ufruf for his son Michael, and then the pieces of the story started to flow together. We had a very, very small little base medrash at that time. It was something about an eighth the size of this room. Very, very small bite, and we were all crushed into this little room over there. And at the Ufruf, there was some cakes and things on the table. And Michael, his young son, the psychologist, starts to tell over his story. What was his story? So it turns out that he and his Kala, his bride-to-be, Deborah, turns out she was not Jewish. She was a Lebanese Christian, but with a very, Middle Eastern Semitic look. They had studied together to become doctorates. They got their doctorate in psychology, family therapy, although they were not married, somewhere in Vermont. They picked themselves up and they said, before we settle down, now that we both have our doctorates, we've achieved this high degree, and now we can settle down. They said, before we settle down, let's go hitchhiking through Europe. That was popular back then. I did it myself, for a while when I was a young chipper myself. And they went hitchhiking through, and they went and they stayed at hostels and these type of things, and they were going through Europe. So as he's telling his story, he's describing that they're traveling through Europe, and somewhere in France, they meet a little old man on a bicycle. And he says to them, you're Jewish? He says, what are you doing here in France? He says, why didn't you go to Israel? He plants this idea in their head. They had no idea, no thought of going to Israel. But since he planted this idea, so when they got to the Mediterranean Sea through Greece, so now it's attaching them by water so they got on a junket, they got on a boat, and they ended up coming to Israel because of that suggestion that the man made. Now they're up in the North Country in Safat, and they're traveling around artist colony and mystical, whatever it is, and suddenly they bump into a little old man on a bicycle. Right? I remember at that moment over there, and he says, why don't you go to, to Jerusalem? What are you doing up here? And check into a yeshiva, he suggested him. I remember Reb Nota Schiller, who was the dean of Or Sameach in Jerusalem, a very elegant man and an all-time wonderful person and an amazing fundraiser. He had turned this fellow, Joe Tannenbaum, maybe some people heard of Joe and Faye Tannenbaum, one of the all-time charitable givers, one of the all-time philanthropists in the Jewish world. He turned him on to Torah and mitzvahs and on to philanthropy. And his name graces dozens and dozens of buildings throughout Eretz Yisrael, Boys Town, you name it. And he happened to be there that day for the Ufruf. And we're sitting in this cramped quarters over there, and Nota Schiller had his arm draped around the back of the chair of Joe Tannenbaum. And I remember Nota Schiller saying out loud at that moment over there, he says, Joe, he says, you have no idea how expensive it is to put these little men on bicycles all over the world. Right? And I remember... He said they ended up checking into yeshiva, and since they checked into yeshiva, she went in. She told them who she was and what she was all about. They decided to accept her as a candidate. She said, "This is interesting." He said, "This is interesting for me too." They immersed themselves in what they were doing. The next 4 or 5 months go by, and suddenly, the old father in New York, a widower, living a swank life in lower Manhattan, suddenly finds out that his son got caught up in a cult in Jerusalem. And he's going to go fish him out. He's going to go collect him. So the son's telling the story over there. So the father came over to help grab his son out. And he says to him, "Dad, I'm ready to go with you." He says, "But before you go," he says, "let's sit down in a class." They start the class. And a Torah class is not just not just a lecture. It becomes an interactive thing. They start learning a Gemara, and then another class. And the father asks a question. They get, we got a feisty one here. Every time they say something, he challenges it. And then the rabbi proves to him something else. And logic, they have some wonderful and thoughtful people. And suddenly he says, "Wow," he says, "this is a different Judaism that I remember sitting over there in the pew saying, Amen, 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 Amen." He says, "This is interesting." And he ended up wanting to learn and to stay himself. He says, "This is what I've been missing out on my whole life." And he stayed in Jerusalem for the next 3-4 months. And eventually he says, "But I have an apartment. I have to sublet. I have to do something." He says, "And where can I continue?" They said, "We have a fledgling branch. We just opened up in Muncie." He says, "Maybe you can plug in over there." So he came back to the United States to arrange his affairs and to sublet his apartment. And he came to Or Sameach in Muncie. And I came 3-4 months later myself. It was another 5 or 6 months until his son got engaged. And then Deborah ended up taking the immersion that she needed to take. And then they were introduced to each other as new people, and they got engaged. So I remember the wedding. It was an amazing wedding. It was wow. All the tzaddikim, all the great people were there. And then after the wedding, so it was a little bit of an exhausting affair for the father. I remember he disappeared for a week. I don't know where he went. He came back a week later. Apparently, he went down to Florida. I remember the day he came back, there was a bris in the yeshiva, in the room that we had the learning in. That was the same place where we had the bris and we had the food and entertainment. And so we were putting the tables back. And he and I, our room was right next door. So we went right next door, and we used to drink a l'chaim or two. He would smoke a cigarette. I didn't smoke cigarettes. And then we would play a game of chess and discuss things. He just came back from Florida. And I never forget the conversation that we had. Because he says, "I just came back from Florida." He had this raspy, "I just came back from Florida." I said, "Oh, that's where you went." He says, "Went down there to convalesce after the wedding, so much excitement." He says, "But I'm so glad to be back." He says, "That was the Judaism I left behind." He says, "Down there." He says, "Everybody's playing shuffleboard and waiting for the Malach HaMaves." That's what he said, waiting for the angel of death. Wow, such a brutal assessment. And I told him, "I'm thinking about leaving the yeshiva." I said, "It's not easy." I thought when I came, I'm going to find out about God and about spirituality and certain, things would magically be cured within me. And I find that it's not so easy. You're talking about a cow growing another cow, and it's Aramaic, and it's Rashi script, and the rabbi's kids know 10 times more than you, and it's humiliating. And then he barked at me. He said, "Labe!" He spoke to me in a way that none of the Rebbeim would ever speak. He says, he's looking at me like I'm a young fellow, and here I am. He says, "I'm 68 years old. You're only 23, 24 years old." He says, "If I were you," he says, "I would stay in yeshiva and learn." And I remember okay. And he installed it into me, don't move, don't budge. And I stayed, and I learned, Baruch Hashem. And then he said to me, he says, "Here I am, 68 years old. He says, and I never felt more hope in my life than I feel right now. He said, I want to get married. I remember that one. Oh, really? And he spoke to one of the Rebbeim who gave him advice. Back then, there was not such a market. I don't know what the market is now either. 68-year-old Baal Tshuva, he ended up taking an ad out. One of the rabbis said in the Jewish press, he took an advertisement out. It turns out there was a Hasidic guy who fixes television sets, right? Who was fixing a television set in Borough Park, and he happened to see the two-line ad that a 68-year-old Baal Tshuva is looking for a shidduch. He says, I have a sister who was a secretary in Philadelphia, and she remembered that her father had learned the last 20 some odd years of his life, and she was a widow herself, and so he introduced it, and I remember he came back, and it was like one or two times, and then now he got engaged. I was the only bacher that was allowed at the wedding, right? I was his best man, his shomer. It was the only time, I remember many times I was the one standing by the doors, 8.5 minutes at the in the yichud room, where we had trouble keeping the chassan kala, in the yichud room, not because the photographer was coming out, because he came out to get a coffee, and he came out to get a cigarette, and he came out to, now you got to start the 8.5 minutes over again. But after a while, he ended up dropping the cigarettes. He changed a couple of his teetotaling, habits. Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky says, you grow a long beard, you'll have a riches yamim. He told him, he gave him a bracha. He ended up moving to Yerushalayim. A couple of times that my wife and I went there with the kids. We stayed over there in Geula. We called him Bubby and Zadie Tobin. Michael ended up marrying. He brought his practice to Eretz Israel, and he lived nearby. He lived actually in the West Bank, and they had a beautiful family together. Meanwhile, when we went over, he would sit in the base medrash or sameach, and he ended up packing away and mastering a few masechtas. I remember he used to take out a piece of paper to say B'rei Nefashos. Right? In order to say Asher Yatzar, he would sit there and point at the letters, not out of tzidkas, because he couldn't remember the brachas. Nothing stayed inside. It just, he had to repeat it over and over again. But after a while, he ended up learning how to mastering, and he ended up learning for the next 20 some odd years. And he was the Zaidi in the yeshiva, because sometimes when fellows came over there, their parents had rejected. What did we do wrong? What did we do wrong? We'll go check our mezuzahs. We raised you right, and we gave you bar mitzvah. Now you went out and became religious. What happened? What did we do so wrong? And so they felt rejected. We'll come home, we're going to do an intervention, just like he went to go do for his son. He understood what it was all about. He understood how wrong they were. So he adopted all those kids for the next 20 some odd years. They came to a Shabbos table, and he gave them encouragement to do the right thing, like he gave me encouragement. Then a friend of mine came back from Eretz Israel one summer, and he handed me a tape. And and I looked at it, and he was like staring at me to see what my reaction was, and I hadn't heard. Because there on the tape it says, it was from the Or Sameach tape library, and it said, Hesped for the Shloshim of Mordechai Tobin, Zecher Tzadik Levracha. I remember getting a shock, and then a double shock. Because the first shock that I got was, oh my God, I didn't know. My friend said, you didn't know? I thought you knew. And I'm just giving you, for the Shloshim. I said, I hadn't heard about it. And the second wave of the shock I got was that title that they put over at the end over there, Zecher Tzadik Levracha. Oh my God. A Zecher Tzadik Levracha. Here's a fellow that started at the age of 68 years old, reading no Hebrew, right? Voted least likely, to earn such a title. You can say, okay, they exaggerated. Okay, maybe they exaggerated, But halavai, they should exaggerate like that about you and me, that we should end up with a title like that coming in focused in our general direction. A Zecher Tzadik Levracha. Ain't that something? See, here's a fellow start up with, and it's a tzviya, alachas kama v'kama. Many of us are not at that point yet, or we have exposure to aleph days. So how much more so, we can make something, and we can do something. Who knows how many people he encouraged, how many people he gave that push along, and at that moment when they were feeling weak and they wanted to cave in, and he said, if I were you, I would continue to learn, just like he gave to me. And even from his own Torah accomplishments, Lefum Tzara Agra. So, we never discount anybody. At the age of 68, maybe it would have been something to sweep away. But from that point over there, he became a Zecher Tzadik Levracha. Let me just tell you one other story, an amazing story. A friend of mine, Eliezer, who also lives in Eretz Israel, when you come to his house, he has a picture that I first noticed when he lived here in the United States. You come into his house, and there's a picture that looks exactly like him. But it's like you could tell it's one of these, it's a little bit of an older picture, like a black and white picture that's been colored in. And the story is, I said, Eliezer, that looks like you. Is that you? He says, no, that's my grandfather, Reb David Friedman. I said, it looks exactly like you. He says, let me tell you the following story. A few times I've been back and asked him to fill in just to make sure that I get the details. He was sitting Shiva here last year, and I went to see him and I said, listen, I just got to hear one more time to make sure I tighten up some of the details. I still feel like I'm missing certain details, like the name of the city, but he tells me the following thing. He came to, I think it was Hartford, Connecticut, to a wedding maybe 35, 36 years ago. A fellow in the yeshiva was getting married from Orsameich and Eretz Israel, and a number of the Bachrim, they came to this out-of-town shul. What's happening in an out-of-town shul? So they have the upstairs, like here. They have they have the hall upstairs, the davening, and downstairs is the simcha hall. You know, like this building was structured like that probably. What happened was, so while the wedding was taking place, he wanted to do an old-time shtick that was called the Tchias HaMesim dance. You ever heard of the Tchias HaMesim dance? I'm sure not so many people know about it. It's an old-time vaudeville routine where people walk around, you know, like policemen or after some guy who's playing like he's drunk, and they finally catch this bandit, and they, you know, and bang bang, and some little guns go off, you know, with the flags out, and the guy falls dead, and they have a little funeral, bum bum bum, and the music's still down. They play taps for him. They have a minor funeral over there, and then suddenly the guy wakes up, and they start to do the Tchias HaMesim. They start to revive him back life. So my friend said, in order to find a prop, in order to make it a little bit more, so he goes back to, he wanders away from the wedding. He goes up to the shul area, and he's looking around. He's foraging through the shul to see if he can find a kittel that he can, when the guy, pretends that he's passed away, they're going to dress him up. They're going to have a funeral with a kittel, and they're going to put a flower in his hand. Everything. So while my friend Eliezer is walking around and looking for this kittel, suddenly the gabbai in the shul. There's always the guy who's in charge of the shul. The one that watches how long you keep your hand in the pushka, like you're putting in or you're taking out. You're leaning back in the chair. The one who's watching zealously. This old European guy says, "What are you doing here?" And Eli says, "I'm here for the wedding." He says, "I know, there's a wedding." I says, "What are you doing in the shul?" The fellow says, "Well, I came to get, a kittel." "Oh, yeah, you came to get a kittel. We're doing the Tchias HaMesim dance downstairs." And the fellow's looking at him suspiciously. My friend Eliezer knows how to talk with people nicely. He says to this fellow, he says, "No, Rabbi from Vikim, so where do you come from?" The fellow says, "Europe." He says, "No, where in Europe?" He says, he names a town, he says Hungary. He says, "Where in Hungary?" He names a town. My friend Eliezer says, "My grandfather, my grandparents, my mother was from that town." He says, "What was the family name?" He says, "Friedman." And the fellow looks at him, the old Jew looks at him, he says, "David Friedman?" He says, "Yes, that was my grandfather." He says, "You look just like him." He says, "That was my grandfather, David Friedman. I have a picture that we look exactly alike. It's almost the same person." He says, "You look exactly like David Friedman." He says, "Your grandfather was a great man. He was a wealthy man." He says, "I heard. He didn't survive the war. He used to support all the Torah institutions in town. There wasn't anything that happened that didn't have his stamp and his support. He kept everything going. He ran the whole town. He was the most important person." He says, "Yes, that was my grandfather." "You knew him?" He says, "Of course, everybody knew him, and everybody knew him. He was amazing." And now this fellow gets ashen white. We'll finish up with this. He says, "Well, what? What is it?" He says, "I'm one of the only survivors from that whole town." He says, "I came back after the war to see if anything, the town was wiped out. I came to the shul. I'm looking through to see, maybe forget about a Sefer Torah, maybe a page, maybe a page from a siddur. Nothing. Everything was wiped out. Everything was destroyed. The shul was ravaged." He says, "The only thing was standing," he says, "was your grandfather's stender." He says, "I went over to it, I opened up, and all I could find in there was his kittel." He says, "And I took your grandfather's kittel." He says, "And in the DP camps," he says, "I used it to perform thousands of weddings, to bring husbands and wives together to wear a wedding." He says, "Until it was worn threadbare, and I had to bury it with Seamus." And here it is, 30 some odd years later, his grandchild comes to me. He says, at a wedding, in order to perform the mitzvah dance, the Tchias HaMesim dance, in search of a kittel. Right? He said, you see how tightly woven Hashem makes life and makes history in such a way that sometimes we don't see it, but when we do see it, then we see that the Mishnah is telling us a very, very important thing over here, that everything, don't dismiss. You never know when something is going to be important. You've passed that key, but that key is going to be important. Don't throw it away. It didn't open the door that you wanted to open to, but don't toss it away. Maybe it'll open a different door. It has its reason for being. Don't throw away keys. Don't throw away this person's number. Don't throw away this person. And that's what the Mishnah says over here. He says, Hu Omer al tehi vaz l'chol adam. Don't be dismissive of anybody. Va'al tehi maflig l'chol davar. Don't throw away anything. She'ein l'chol adam she'ein lo shah. Every person has their moment. Ve'ein lecha davar she'ein lo makam, and everything that's in this world and everybody in this world has their reason for being. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening. Appreciate it.